We've got quite a piece here. The case for a theocratic society.
Yeah.
It's a pretty bold vision,
It
right?
really is. It is.
Basically, it's saying that a government,
Mm.
based on Christian principles,
Mm-hmm.
is the best way forward for everybody.
It's really fascinating, the way they connect the decline in morals with the need for something more absolute, something more divine.
Yeah, and they don't. They definitely don't hold back. They lay out a pretty stark picture
Yeah.
of where they think society has gone wrong. Rampant immorality, disregard for life itself,
Right.
attacks on the family, materialism, just
Yeah.
you name it. It's a pretty long list.
It's a long list, and it's interesting to see how this connects with how people are feeling today. There's a sense of things kind of unraveling,
Oh,
loss
yeah.
of meaning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the source argues that these problems really come from rejecting, God's law.
Yeah, abandoning those biblical principles leads to chaos, like building a house on sand.
Right. It makes sense. And, they offer solutions, which is interesting. One that really jumped out at me was their idea to use AI to, detect blasphemy online
Well,
and filter it.
wow, that's something else. Think about that. Using technology
Yeah.
for moral standards. I mean, can an algorithm even understand blasphemy?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a good point. Yeah. Where's the line between, protecting religious feelings and free speech?
Right, exactly. It's complex. And they address it, which is interesting.
Yeah. And they really dive into
Perfect.
some hot button issues, right? Abortion, family, healthcare, poverty, immigration, climate change, everything through this lens.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how they ground their arguments in Scripture. Like with abortion, they bring up Psalm 139.13. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. They're saying that shows life begins at conception.
Yeah.
And that makes abortion murder.
Yeah. It's a powerful argument. It resonates with a lot of people.
It does. It taps into
Yeah.
the sanctity of life.
Mhm. They also talk of the Sabbath, that day of rest,
Mm-hmm.
spiritual reflection. And they seem concerned about how it's kind of eroded in modern times.
Yeah, they propose some pretty big changes. Limiting work on Saturdays, public awareness, community stuff, even penalties for breaking the Sabbath.
Wow, penalties. It's pretty serious. I wonder how that would work, with all the different faiths we have.
Right. How do you enforce that? What about businesses that rely on the weekend?
Right. What about people who observe a different day?
Exactly.
It's definitely a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
But it shows how strongly they feel about aligning our lives, even our laws,
Yeah.
with these biblical principles.
Absolutely. It's a radical reordering of society,
Yeah.
putting spiritual values first, God's law above all else.
And family is a big one for them, too. They paint a pretty grim picture
Yeah.
of what they call its decline, divorce, out-of-wedlock births, government policies that they think are undermining it.
It's interesting how they're critical of what they see as an attack on the biblical definition of marriage and family. One man, one woman for life. They say anything else is bad for society.
And they put a lot of emphasis on, biblical child rearing, parental authority.
Right.
They really believe that kids need strong discipline, guidance,
Yeah.
based on, the Bible.
And they connect that to the moral decline,
Yeah.
When the family breaks down, society follows.
Yeah, they see strong families as the foundation for a strong society.
Exactly.
But let's get to the heart of it. Their vision for transitioning the U.S. and eventually the world to a theocratic state.
Yeah, they lay out this plan. It's really strategic and detailed. It starts with building that religious base, getting the faithful involved in politics and culture.
It's like a roadmap for a
Yeah,
revolution.
exactly. They talk about gaining political power, reforming the legal system, making it biblical, changing societal values to Christian ones, and ultimately consolidating power in a central religious authority.
Wow, consolidating power, that's intense. What are they thinking of there?
It's really interesting. They argue that for a real theocracy to work, there has to be a central authority to interpret and enforce God's law, like ancient Israel,
Say like a religious council or something.
They don't say exactly, but it's implied all laws and policies would be subject to this religious authority, making sure they line up with the Bible.
That's a big change from how things work now.
It is. It brings up questions about separation of church and state, which is, central to America.
Yeah. And what about the practicalities? How would it even work? How would they deal with different interpretations, other faiths, even atheists?
Those are great questions. And that's where we need to dig deeper into their arguments. They do address some of those concerns, but we'll get into that as we continue our deep dive.
I'm definitely interested to see how they think this would all work in practice.
Me too. It's complex and challenging, but it's worth looking at carefully.
Yeah.
So let's look at how this theocratic society would handle legal stuff, you know. They talk about a complete overhaul, like biblical courts instead of our ones. Existing laws would be scrutinized, revised, maybe even replaced to fit with biblical doctrines and even biblical punishments.
Biblical punishments. That sounds pretty intense. What kind of things are they talking about?
Well, things like stoning for adultery, exile for certain offenses it's clear they believe in, that eye for an eye, justice, from the Old Testament.
That's definitely different from what we have now, which is more about rehabilitation, due process. How do they reconcile those ancient punishments with, modern ideas of human rights?
They argue that biblical justice is about righteousness, upholding God's order. These punishments, they're harsh, but they're deterrents to show how serious it is to break God's law.
It's a challenging perspective.
Yeah.
Especially in a society that values individual rights and freedoms,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how they would ensure fairness and prevent,
abuse
the power.
Right. The source also talks about transforming society
Yeah.
by promoting biblical values in everything: education, family life, even business.
Yeah. They picture a society where Christian principles are just woven in to daily life, from schools to how families raise kids to the ethical standards for businesses.
They even suggest restricting access to secular media and entertainment. That they see as challenging religious beliefs.
Right. They see things like movies, music, TV shows that promote secular values as a bad influence, especially on young people. They think a theocratic government has a duty to protect people from these harmful influences.
That sounds a lot like censorship. I mean, who decides what's harmful or anti-Christian? Wouldn't that be super subjective?
It raises those concerns, yeah, about free speech.
Right.
And the possibility of silencing dissent. It's one of the many tricky things that come up when you think about a theocratic system.
Yeah. The source seems to think that true freedom comes from aligning with God's will, not from, individual desires or secular ideas.
Yeah, exactly. They argue that focusing on individual autonomy, like secular society does, leads to moral relativism, which undermines a just and stable society.
Right. They draw a sharp contrast between the chaos they see in secular society and the order they imagine in a theocracy.
It's a powerful contrast. They present theocracy as the answer to the problems in the world, a way to restore balance and purpose.
Let's look at some specifics of what they consider moral decay. They seem really worried about what they call the culture of death.
Right. They're against things like abortion and euthanasia, which they see as violating the commandment to choose life. They believe a theocratic government would make laws to protect all life, from conception to natural death.
It's interesting how they frame these issues as spiritual battles.
Yeah. They see legalizing abortion, for example, as a win for Satan and a sign of society rejecting God.
They also seem troubled by what they see as an attack on the family.
Absolutely. They point to rising divorce rates, same-sex marriage being accepted, more non-traditional families, as proof that society's lost its way.
And they're especially worried about how this affects children.
Right. They believe kids need to be raised in a traditional two-parent home with clear gender roles and a focus on the Bible. They say anything else hurts the family and ultimately harms children.
So what would a theocratic society do to address these things?
Well, they talk about laws that support traditional marriage and family, like banning same-sex marriage or making divorce harder. They also want policies that encourage stay-at-home parenting and religious education for kids.
They clearly see the family as the foundation
Yeah.
and think a theocratic government should protect those traditional values.
That's exactly.
They think a strong society starts with strong families.
And they're willing to use the power of the state to make that happen.
They also have a lot to say about what they call sexual immorality.
Right. They condemn premarital sex, adultery, pornography, even some entertainment that they think is too suggestive or exploitative. They believe these behaviors are not just sinful, but harmful to individuals and society as a whole.
So how would a theocratic society handle that? Would they try to, legislate morality?
It seems like they think that's possible. They talk about laws to restrict pornography, censor media they consider inappropriate, maybe even punish people for behavior they see as immoral.
That raises some serious questions about personal freedom and privacy.
It does. It reminds us that this vision, while it might appeal to some, could also threaten individual liberty.
Right. But they seem to think these restrictions are necessary for a truly moral society.
Yeah, they argue that true freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about living according to God's law, which they believe leads to true happiness and fulfillment.
The source also seems concerned about the influence of secularism and materialism.
Right, they see the pursuit of wealth as a distraction from spiritual things, leading to greed, envy, and discontent. They argue that a theocratic society would prioritize spiritual values, encourage simpler, more God-centered lives.
It's an interesting take on consumerism and always wanting more.
Yeah, and it connects with people who are feeling disillusioned with modern life. Like there's a deeper yearning for meaning and purpose.
They believe true fulfillment comes from serving God and following His will.
Exactly. They argue that a theocratic society would give people the structure and guidance to live good, meaningful lives, create a society that's just, compassionate, and honors God.
Okay, but this all sounds huge. How do they imagine actually making this transition to a theocratic state?
Well, they have this 5-stage plan, and it's really ambitious. It starts with building that religious base, mobilizing the faithful, setting up faith-based institutions, making alliances with like-minded groups.
It sounds like a blueprint for a revolution.
Yeah, they know it won't happen overnight. They think it needs a long-term strategy, working within the system, but also trying to change it from the inside.
So what's next after they build that support?
The next stage is getting political power, electing pro-theocracy candidates, lobbying for laws that reflect biblical values, challenging secular laws they see as against God's law.
It's interesting how they want to work within the system, even though their goal is to change it completely.
Yeah, they seem to believe they can use democracy to get rid of democracy and replace it with something totally different, a government based only on their view of the Bible.
It's a bold move. What about the people who don't agree with them? How would they handle dissent and different viewpoints in this theocratic society?
That's the big question, and we'll have to explore that more. They do address some of these concerns, but their vision definitely raises questions about individual rights, religious freedom, and potential for persecution.
Right. I'm really curious to see how they think this theocratic state would work in a society that's so diverse and has so many different viewpoints.
It's a fascinating question with big implications for the future.
Okay, so they've built that support, gained political power, but how do they see this theocratic society functioning in real life? What about laws, courts? How would that work?
Well, that's where stage 3 comes in. A complete overhaul of the legal system, biblical courts, where judges would rule based on their interpretation of Scripture. Existing laws would be reviewed, revised, maybe even tossed out completely to make sure they align with biblical principles.
Wow, biblical courts. That's a pretty big shift, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that clash with the Constitution?
It definitely would. They admit that putting this in place in a country like the U.S., with its history of secular law, would be a massive challenge. They argue it would need a fundamental change in how Americans see the role of religion in public life.
And what about, different interpretations of the Bible? Even within Christianity, there are so many different views. Who gets to decide what's the right interpretation?
That's a key point. And they do address it. They say in a theocracy, there would have to be a recognized authority, maybe a council of religious scholars, to interpret Scripture and guide legal matters.
So like a religious Supreme Court. Interesting. But what about people who don't follow their specific interpretation? Or people from other faiths, even atheists? Would they be under these biblical laws too?
That's where it gets really complicated. The source is a little vague on that, but they seem to think that while everyone would live under biblical law, there might be some exceptions or accommodations.
Accommodations, like what?
They don't give specifics, but maybe they're imagining a system where non-Christians could practice their religions within certain limits as long as they didn't directly challenge the theocracy.
It sounds like a tough balancing act.
It is.
Trying to combine the absolute authority of biblical law with a society that's so diverse.
Right. It raises questions about religious freedom and whether minority groups might face discrimination.
Okay, so we've got biblical courts, scriptural laws. What about those punishments we discussed? Stoning, exile, would those actually be used?
The source seems to think so. They say these punishments, while harsh by today's standards, are needed to uphold God's order and deter serious offenses.
But wouldn't that be cruel and unusual punishment under our current laws?
Absolutely. They argue that in a theocracy, the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits that, would probably be reinterpreted or even removed because it conflicts with biblical law.
Wow. That really shows how far they're willing to go. to change things.
Yeah.
It highlights the risks of a system where religious beliefs have complete control over secular laws and individual rights.
Right.
So stage 3 is about changing the legal system. What's stage 4?
Stage 4 is about transforming society itself. Education, family, business, even media and entertainment, all reshaped to fit biblical values.
So it's not just the laws, it's the whole culture.
Exactly. They believe real change needs more than just laws. They picture a society where Christian principles are part of everything, from how kids are raised to what kind of businesses can exist.
They even mention restricting media and entertainment.
Right.
That they see as harmful or unchristian.
Yeah, they see movies, music, TV that promote secular values, sex, or violence as corrupting, especially for young people. They think a theocratic government should protect people from that.
That sounds like censorship, doesn't it? Who gets to decide what's harmful?
It does raise those concerns. The source doesn't explain exactly how they would do this, but it's clear they think the government should shape the morals of society.
And finally, stage 5. This is where it all comes together.
Yeah, this is the full realization of the theocratic state, everything in line with the Bible.
But how do they get there?
They talk about consolidating power in a central religious authority, maybe a council of leaders, maybe a single leader. This authority would have final say on laws, policies, even social norms.
So, like a theocracy within a theocracy.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that give a small group too much power?
It would. It raises worries about abuses of power and suppressing dissent.
And what about people who disagree? Would they have any say in this theocratic society?
The source is pretty open about that. They know not everyone will agree, and they expect resistance from people with secular or non-Christian beliefs. They say dissent will be allowed to a point, but ultimately, the theocratic state will be in charge.
So it's a vision of a society that's very divided, with those who have the right beliefs in control and everyone else pushed aside.
That seems to be the idea. They believe the only way to have real harmony is for everyone to live by God's law, as they understand it.
The case for a theocratic society is definitely a bold and interesting vision. It comes from deep faith, but it also raises big questions about freedom, individual rights, and the role of religion in a society with so many different views.
Yeah, it's a vision that some will find inspiring and others will find worrying. But no matter what you think, it's a conversation worth having. It makes us think about faith and politics, the nature of authority, and the kind of society we want. What parts resonated with you? What concerns or questions do you have? Those are things for you to ponder or